Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm going to go through the first part of our fiscal briefing, which we call the quick look. Just hit some highlights about the budget, and then if there's time permitting, happy to answer questions the committee has. So on the top of the page 1, and it's on the screen, you can see the budget growth in fiscal 26. Overall, the budget is a $67.3 billion budget, grows about $800 million over fiscal 25, about 1% growth. General funds actually declined by $274 million, down to just over $27 billion. A couple of key points about the budget. There's a cash balance of $106 million at the end of fiscal 26, so it is balanced on a cash basis. There's also over $2 billion in the state's rainy day fund. That's about 8% of general fund revenues, which beats the Spending Affordability Committee's goal for the rainy day fund balance. In addition to the cash balance, we often talk about the structural balance, which is whether ongoing revenues are sufficient to cover ongoing costs. The Spending Affordability Committee had a goal for fiscal 26 of structural balance. The governor failed to meet that goal. He's about $186 million short of structural balance. The Spending Affordability Committee goal has been met by the General Assembly in all but 1 year in the 40-plus years that it's existed. So you will likely see budget and tax taking actions, whether it's revenues or more cuts or some combination to close that structural gap. The other key thing to know about the budget is there's a Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, which has about $3 billion worth of budget balancing actions. Page 2 hits the highlights of that act. These are the things that you need to change statute in order to get these savings or get these revenues. There are other savings in the budget just that the governor could do without statutory changes. The biggest group is at the top there, the revenue adjustments, about $1.3 billion. Largest item, almost $700 million from personal income tax reform. I will talk about that more in a couple of pages. Under transfers, you'll see about $633 million of transfers, the biggest there being the Local Income Tax Reserve Fund. This is a fund that is often borrowed from during difficult budget times, and the governor has a plan to repay it over a 10-year period. Spending reductions is the other area of significant change, about $1 billion of cuts. The biggest is just putting less money into the rainy day fund than statute requires, so about a $420 million savings. Again, you still have $2 billion in the rainy day fund even with this cut. There's also about $140 million of savings from increasing the Medicaid hospital assessment, both in the current year and for fiscal 26, and actually permanently. This is an assessment on hospital charges in the state. Most of the costs get passed on to the insurers and the other payers. The hospital industry absorbs a small part of it. It raises the assessment on an annual basis from about $300 million to about $400 million. Third item under cuts I would note that you probably hear from local governments about is teachers' retirement costs. The governor is shifting about $93 million of teachers' retirement costs to local governments in fiscal 26, and that's a permanent shift of that $93 million of costs. There are a number of other cuts delineated in the chart, and there's another $100 million of other that are many small little cuts that I'm not going to go into.
Can I just ask, of the $93 million that's one of the teachers, how is that, like, how are they paying for that then if it's being shifted to them?
So the local governments themselves, not the school systems, the local governments will have to provide that money to cover that cost. So the counties in Baltimore City.
So it's being shifted to them as a savings to the state bottom line, but they've got to pick up the balance.
Correct.
And they are already in their own issues. Okay.
Yeah. Overall, there's about $144 million of cost shifts in the budget from state to the local governments. If you care, page 60 in the document shows you county by county how much the cost shift is for your jurisdiction.
Thank you.
Page 60.
60. Thank you.
60. Yep.
Thank you, sir.
Shows the different components and how much each county is hit.
And this is a simple question, make sure I'm reading this right. All of the numbers, there are a few numbers that have negatives, so I'm assuming those actually increases in spending.
Right.
Everything else is, okay. So the number at the very top, the closing balance before legislative action.
So that very top number is before the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, the budget is out of balance by nearly $2.9 billion. The act includes about $3 billion of actions that erase that deficit and leave you with $106 million fund balance at the end of the year.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
For the fund, the rainy day fund, but how much less does this grow? Does the government grow? Does that have an impact on ratings? It could, but it doesn't.
Right, so, so the governor's putting $420 million less than statute requires. We're still at, again, over $2 billion, 8%. 8% historically is pretty high level of balance in the rainy day fund for Maryland, so I don't think that the rating agencies will have a concern with us being at 8%. It's only in the last few years we've been up in the 8 to 10% range.
The $180 million that is short for next year, how many governors are proposed budgets that have any cap? Or has it been always the legislature chopping that?
There have been various governors, Governor Hogan among them, who did not always comply with the spending affordability committee goals, but the General Assembly has always tried to comply with those goals.
Just one question on page 60. As I read 60, I'm just picking Baltimore County as an example. It looks like the county will be receiving $18 million less this coming year than what, last year, or than otherwise would expected to receive?
So these are costs that the county would have assumed the state was paying in fiscal 26. And the state is saying, nope, we're going to shift costs to you, like the teacher's retirement, where the state was supposed to be paying, in Baltimore County's case, that $9.4 million in the left-hand column. It's supposed to be a state cost. The governor's changing statute to make it a county cost.
Okay. So somehow the county is going to have to figure out how to deal with that.
Yes.
Gotcha.
I will say, just in some context, as I'll get into the governor's tax plan in a couple of minutes, the governor's tax proposal by the governor's estimates provides about $100 million a windfall to counties in terms of income tax revenue. So the counties will be getting some unexpected revenue that will help perhaps mitigate some of the costs that are being shifted. All right, so I'm on page 3. Taking a look at the big picture. So this gets back to that structural outlook issue. So the blue dotted lines on page 3 show the legislative services forecast from December when we briefed the Spending Affordability Committee. And you can see we were expecting huge structural budget gaps, $2.5 billion in fiscal 26, $6 billion by 2030. And these were that 2030 number is pretty historically high. The governor's budget plan would erase a significant portion of the structural gap. As you can see, improves the outlook in every year of the forecast. However, even with his plan, starting especially in fiscal 28 through 30, you can see there remains a substantial structural gap, even if you adopt the governor's plan as is. So this is not the end of your sort of budget stress. There's likely to be another round at some point of actions to erase that longer term deficit. Turning to page 4. So again, back in December when we briefed spending affordability, we were projecting a cash deficit of $400 million in the current year and about $3 billion for fiscal 26, the upcoming year. The governor has erased that combined $3.4 billion deficit through a combination, and you can see about 40% spending cuts, 40% revenues, about 20% fund balance transfers. Now, page 5 takes a little deeper dive on where are the spending cuts coming. So this is, again, versus our forecast back in December. The biggest area of spending cut in the far left is the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act changes the governor's proposing $1 billion. I talked about a couple of the big ones. The third, fourth, and fifth bars there from the left show you kind of the major policy areas where there have been reductions. The first is the Child Care Scholarship Program, which provides subsidies for low and moderate income families. The governor is proposing to cap enrollment at that program at about 42,000 children. That is about the level we are currently at. The forecast assume we get to about 50,000 or a little over 50,000. So significantly fewer children would be served than would otherwise be served if we didn't cap the enrollment. Yeah, so in fiscal 23, it was about 23,000 people, and now, currently we're at 42,000. So it's grown dramatically. So the governor's trying to put some brakes on the growth. The second area of cuts is in higher education, public higher education. The university system in Maryland in actual dollars is getting $106 million less in fiscal 26 than it did in fiscal '25. So they will have to absorb that either through making cuts to their spending or, raising tuition and fees or some combination of the two. The third area of significant kind of policy-oriented cuts is Developmental Disabilities Administration. They are running at a very large deficit in the current year, which the administration largely addresses in the budget plan. But the administration is proposing some cost containment, about $97 million in general fund savings in the current year from changing provider payment rates and some other changes, and about $235 million of general fund savings in fiscal '26. Budget and Taxes already had one hearing on this topic, and I think there will continue to be a lot of attention on that issue. On the far right, you can see there's a couple of areas where there's actually more spending than we were projecting. One is Medicaid, which seems to be differences of opinion about enrollment growth and medical inflation and so forth. There's not any real policy-driven change there. And then there's about $187 million of what we're calling discretionary enhancements. They are outlined on the next page, page 6. I'm not going to go through that list. You can peruse it at your leisure. I would say about 2/3 of the list are parts of what the governor is calling an economic stimulus proposal. He's trying to stimulate the private sector in Maryland, which has grown very modestly in recent years. So, some various initiatives to try to get the Maryland economy to grow faster. All right, so let's turn to taxes on page 7. So, I'm sorry.
See, is that sending money to the executive to grow the executive?
Yeah, so one of the big items there's more money than we expected is overtime in the Department of Public Safety, about $50 million more than we were expecting. So it's those type of operational costs for agencies, nothing glitzy or terribly interesting, but costs to run the agency.
Does it include trying to hire additional staff in public safety?
Yeah, I mean, the budget assume right now about 10% of state positions are vacant. Public safety is one that has a high level of vacancies. The budget has enough funding to reduce the vacancies statewide to about 7.5%. So there is money in the budget to improve state hiring.
And the only reason I'm asking, I know with parole and probation, their caseloads are very high. And I think the new director that's coming in was talking about trying to bring caseloads down. But I think she said for, I guess, people who are the higher risk, she wanted to bring caseloads down to, I think, 1 to 20 or something that she said. And I'm thinking to do that, you need to hire a whole lot more people. And the question I had was, is that in the budget?
Yeah, so actually, if you look on page 6, there's a $5 million item, 2/3 of the way down. They're actually going to add additional staff for parole and probation. So both trying to fill the current vacancies and giving them additional staff to try to improve their caseload ratios.
And that's about $5 million?
$5 million, yes, sir.
How many people do you?
That's probably could get you about 100 people.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to turn on page 7 to the income tax changes that the governor is proposing. Yes.
The agency operations, the overtime on that, is that, I'm going to guess that that's being, because there's a reduced number of law enforcement, so they're actually having to work more, so they're getting paid at a higher clip because of the short staffing numbers.
Yes, as the other senator commented, the public safety has had trouble hiring for a number of years now. So because they're short
So
staffed, there's a lot of
public safety,
overtime.
though, encompasses state police, parole and probation, and corrections across the
It's
state?
corrections and parole and probation.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
So, all right. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. But those aren't the only areas that have been, that are in need of beefing up in terms of staff. I mean, a lot of our departments have a lot of vacancies that have been needing to be beefed up over the last couple of years. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, like I said, statewide, about 10% of state positions are vacant. That's a very high number, but we've been even higher in recent years.
Right.
Public safety's had a lot of challenges. The state hospitals and the health department have had a lot of challenges hiring nurses and other direct care staff. In the Department of Information Technology has trouble hiring IT professionals, and partly because our salaries aren't as competitive as they need to be with the private sector. So,
Okay, Thank you.
And there are other examples too.
Yeah,
Those are-
MDE, water inspectors,
Sure.
all of it. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try again on the income tax. All right, page 7 highlights the proposed changes that the governor's making to the income tax. Altogether, the items I'm going to highlight on this page would generate about $820 million of revenue in fiscal '26. One of the significant changes is shown in the chart there, the changes to the tax brackets themselves. And we've got the single filer on the left-hand side and the joint filers on the right-hand side. You can see the yellow areas are where the tax rate is changing. And so there are rate changes both at the bottom and the top of the scale. At the bottom, instead of having a bunch of different tax rates, the governor's going to have one consolidated 4.70% tax rate. So for the first $1,000 of your income, you're going to pay 4.7% rather than 2%. And for the second 1,000, you'll pay 4.7 instead of 3%, and so forth. You can see for the individual filers between 3,000 and 100,000 of income, they're actually getting a tax cut going from 4.75% to 4.7%. A very modest tax cut, but a reduction in the rate for the income that falls into that bracket. The other changes are at the tops of the brackets where the governor's adding 2 new tax brackets. So the highest tax bracket in Maryland currently is 5.75%. The governor is proposing a 6.25% rate and a 6.5% rate. They kick in at $500,000 and $1 million for the individual, and at $600,000 and $1.2 million for the joint filers. So that's one of the changes. In addition to those changes, the governor is proposing a temporary capital gains income tax surcharge of 1%. It would apply to anybody who has taxable income of more than $350,000, whether they're single filer or joint filer, and they would pay an extra 1% on their capital gains income. That is for 4 years. All the other changes I'm going to talk about are permanent. That capital gains surcharge is for 4 years. The rationale, as I understand it, is that the revenue from that is about $128 million. The governor has this economic stimulus package that adds up to $128 million. So he's saying he's targeting that temporary revenue to trying to stimulate the economy.
Impact, I mean, like, in certain parts of the state, especially for, joint filing, that's not a lot of money for, a household in certain parts of the state. It's a tremendous amount of money for other parts, but how many Marylanders will that impact?
We are working on that analysis. I don't have a number at this point. All right, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sir.
I guess with the stimulating the economy, is there a particular program that you call it? Does it have a program, or what is it that the governor?
So the governor has a whole list of things. Many of them are shown on page 6.
Page 6.
Kind of spending that's supposed to encourage growth in the private sector in Maryland. Some of it's just capital spending to build headquarters for a company. Some of it is $25 million is in the Sunny Day Fund to try to attract new businesses to Maryland, as sort of incentive payments and so forth.
Have you, or are you going to vet any of these efforts in terms of whether they really, other than being said to stimulate the economy, would effectively stimulate the economy, or is there any history that this funding this would stimulate the economy?
Many of these are new initiatives, but we will be, in our budget process, we'll be looking at them closely.
Thank you.
Back on page 7, the bullet points highlight a couple other key things about the income tax proposal. One is the governor is proposing to double the standard deduction in Maryland. So it would be $5,600 for an individual filer, $11,200 for a joint filer. But at the same time, he's removing the ability to itemize on your state taxes. So there'll be no itemizing your Maryland taxes under his proposal. This, along with the increase in the tax brackets, are the 2 drivers of the additional revenue.
So an elderly couple that has a lot of medical expenses and currently deducts or itemizes those would not be able to do that in the future, correct?
Correct.
Have you done an analysis to see how this provision, so right now people just transfer over to their state taxes what the number from their federal taxes. Will they have to now add back in on their state tax reform all the deductions they took on their federal taxes?
Essentially, yes. Yeah.
It sounds complicated. Have you done a study to see how this is going to affect various demographic groups?
We are working on the fiscal note on this proposal. I mean, the numbers I'm presenting are all the administration's numbers right now. We're trying to do quite a bit of analysis around various aspects of it.
Okay, thank you.
Just to give you a little perspective, about 23% of Marylanders currently itemize on their state taxes. So that's the group of people who would be impacted. And not surprisingly, there's a correlation between your income and whether you're itemized. So higher income earners are the ones most likely to be itemizing. Those are really the tax highlights I think I want to talk about. Page 8 provides you the whole gamut of revenues that the governor is proposing. Tax and fee changes, the first 2/3 of that chart. I've talked about quite a few of them. I should note the dollars that are in black go to the general fund. The numbers in blue are going to the Blueprint Fund for Education.
Sorry, I know you glossed over it, but you didn't, so that we're eliminating the child tax credit?
No, we are. So the child tax credit is for very poor families.
Correct.
Right now, you have to have income of $15,000 or less to qualify. The governor's concern with the program is when your income grows to $15,001, you lose the entire credit. So he wants to phase it out to a higher income. So you would still qualify for some credit with income up to $25,000.
So it's expanding it, it's not
Yes.
phasing it out. It says phase out, but I would think that would be,
Well, he's phasing out how, your $500 credit doesn't all go away when your income hits $15,001. It goes
okay.
down.
No, that's what I
slowly.
wanted to make sure of. I just want to make sure. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's more generous.
Okay, good, thanks.
So the numbers on page 8, the green go to the Transportation Trust Fund. The red are dedicated special funds for specific programs or agencies. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things I haven't talked about 6 lines down. Talk about corporate income tax. The governor has two components to his proposal. One is to initiate combined reporting, and the other is to reduce the corporate income tax rate in Maryland from 8.25% to 7.99% over 2 years. You can see that the fiscal impact of that doubles from fiscal 28 to 29. The other kind of interesting change he's proposing is a couple more lines down related to death taxes. The governor is proposing eliminating the state's inheritance tax, which generates about $100 million a year. And to make sure that the net impact of this is zero, he's lowering the estate tax exemption from $5 million to $2 million. And by their scoring, that's a net impact of zero to the state. I'm sure some of you have heard, because I get this question in each committee, the inheritance tax currently, a portion of it is used to fund the registers of wills in every jurisdiction. The administration, I think, didn't realize that, and it was an oversight that they did not essentially provide any funding for the registers of wills. They are aware of that now, and I think they are looking at how to address that concern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the inheritance or the estate tax exemption, what's the federal number? Is it 7?
I think it's within the 13 to 14 million
13 or
range.
14? Okay, but that may change. Doesn't that expire in December? Is that right? It may drop back down to 7?
I have to check. I don't know that.
I think that's okay. Thank you.
I just want to point out, I mean, I've been contacted by a lot of local farmers that those are like generational businesses, and their business is their homestead. And this has a potential to be significantly impactful to them. Am I understanding that correctly, that if their value now of their farm, their land that they work would go over $2 million, they would have to pay an inheritance tax that they probably don't have the liquid assets to pay?
I am not an expert on the estate tax. I have heard this issue. I've talked to counsel in budget and tax, who's more expert than I am on this, and the answer is more complicated than that. I'm happy to put you in touch with someone who can explain it better than I can.
Okay. I'd like to see that, because that's an ongoing concern that I've heard from the farmers in my jurisdiction who worry that from one generation, the parents pass away and the kids take over,
Sure.
that they wouldn't be able to afford the property. Thank you.
Okay, I want to talk about two of the transportation revenues because they're going to get some attention. The first is it generates about $225 million a year from a new retail delivery fee of 75 cents per order. So what this means, you order from, say, Amazon. Even if you order 6 different things and they send it to you in 6 different packages, you're going to pay the 75 cents once. So it's once per order, not per package that you get. The 75 cents only applies if something that you purchase is subject to the sales tax in Maryland. So if you're getting a delivery from a grocery store and all you bought is food, you wouldn't pay the 75 cents. But if you bought one thing from the grocery store in that order that is subject to the sales tax, you would pay the 75 cents. So it's a little complicated in terms of how it'll apply. It also is indexed to inflation, so in future years it would grow above the 75-cent level. The second transportation revenue source of note is the vehicle trade-in allowance. Currently in Maryland, when you buy a car and you're trading in a car, you subtract the value of the trade-in from the new purchase and you only pay the excise tax on the net difference. What the governor's proposing is that you only would get the trade-in allowance if you're buying a vehicle valued at $15,000 or less. So it's only going to apply to purchases of used cars and relatively inexpensive used cars. So it generates quite a bit of revenue for the trust fund. It's going to get, I'm sure, much discussion. So those are sort of the overview of the revenue from taxes and fees. Just a couple more things I wanted to hit on page 9. Some other key features, K through 12 education. Education aid to local school systems grows by $551 million, 6% at the top of page 9. But there are some proposed cost containment actions related to the Blueprint fund and the rollout of that program. The first is there's a behavioral health element of the Blueprint fund, the Consortium on Coordinated Community Supports. The statute requires $130 million a year for that program. The governor is proposing to fund it at $40 million a year. It is funded at $40 million in the current year, so that's where he chose that number from. But it's a permanent change, saving $90 million a year for the Blueprint fund. Second change relates to part of the Blueprint is to slowly reduce the amount of time teachers spend in the classroom so they have more time for collaborative time, for training, for working with their colleagues and so forth. The administration is proposing delaying the funding for that by 4 years. So instead of starting it in fiscal 26, it would start it in 2030. It saves about $124 million in fiscal 26 and more than $500 million in fiscal 29, so a substantial amount of savings there. The third cost containment piece is there's a program called the Concentration of Poverty. This sends money directly to schools with a high percentage of their students living in poverty. The governor is fully funding it in the fiscal 26 budget. For fiscal 27 and 28, he's proposing to pause the growth in the program. So a school that received money in fiscal 26 would still receive that same amount in fiscal 27, but they would probably, under current law, they would grow, that amount would grow, and he was just pausing the growth for the 2-year period. That saves about $70 million in the first year and almost $200 million in fiscal 28. So those are the major kind of cost containment items related to Blueprint. I'm going to jump just for a second to page 12, which shows you a graphic on the Blueprint fund. So the bars total the spending, or the cost of implementing the Blueprint each year from fiscal 24 to fiscal 30. And then the colors show you what the source of the revenue to fund those costs are. And so the blue part is the ongoing revenues to the Blueprint fund. It gets money from the sales tax and from casinos and so forth each year. And that covers most of the costs in fiscal 24 through 27. The green is there's a surplus in the Blueprint fund, and so we use some of that fund balance to cover the rest of the costs in fiscal 24 through 27. Starting in fiscal 28, we'll have exhausted the fund balance in the Blueprint fund. The ongoing revenues are not sufficient to cover all of the costs. So that's where the yellow bars jump in. That's the general fund would have to subsidize, if you will, the Blueprint implementation. So $1.1 billion in 28, growing to $2.6 billion by 2030. That is one of the key drivers of that structural budget challenge I showed you in that fiscal 28 to 30 period, is that the Blueprint Fund can't sustain all of the implementation costs. Let me go to page 10. I just want to say one thing about page 10 that I haven't mentioned already. The third bullet there is about state employee compensation. The budget includes $180 million for a 1% cost of living increase for state employees, plus the regular employee increments or merit increases, if you will, for state employees. So despite the difficult budget times, we continue to raise the state salaries. I think partly that reflects that we have 10% of our positions vacant statewide, so we're trying to improve hiring. Page 11, I just hit on what I think are kind of key issues for the session in terms of the fiscal outlook. One is obviously the long-term sustainability. The other thing to keep in mind is that nothing in this budget assumes major changes at the federal level. So there's two risks to the budget. One is obviously if the federal workforce is substantially cut, because lots of federal workers live in Maryland, that certainly could harm our revenue, the revenue side of our equation. The other is, and you've been seeing it in the news, there's concern that the president and Congress will cut federal grants to state and local governments, which would put us in the position of either not doing things or trying to backfill with state dollars. So there's nothing in the budget plan that takes into account those possibilities, but those are obviously significant risks to our budget outlook, both for fiscal 26 and maybe even more so for the longer term if we see the effect.
Those wheels are already turning.
What's that?
Those wheels are already turning.
Yeah, I mean, they just sent out yesterday for people to take a severance.
Right.
They're expecting a 10% reduction in the federal workforce. And that's just off offering federal employees a 10% or a severance for 8 months, so. But it's definitely gonna have an impact here locally,
Yes.
so, thank you.
The last thing I wanted to talk about here is on this page 11 is the last set of bullets. The Child Victims Act of 2023, which the General Assembly passed, about 3,500 people so far have come forward with what are believed to be credible claims, almost entirely people who were in juvenile facilities going back as far as the 1960s. The maximum tort liability is $890,000. So that's a potentially very substantial liability for the state. The Attorney General's office has hired outside counsel with expertise in these types of cases, and they are working in negotiations with the plaintiffs' counsels. Their hope is to reach some sort of settlement agreement before the end of the legislative session. If they do so, it's likely that settlement agreement would include some sort of payment in either the current year or in fiscal 26. There is no money in the budget for any sort of settlement payment. There is no money reserved outside of the budget for a settlement payment. So if there is an agreement reached, and it would likely be hundreds of millions of dollars you're talking about as a first-year payment, the state would need to find the money to make that first settlement payment. And again, that would likely be before the end of session, because there's some level of urgency, because if they don't get it settled before the end of session, then they would have to either wait until next session or have a special session to appropriate money for a settlement.
And this is a question, because this came through our committee, but what I don't recall is with that legislation, did we give potential victims a time frame so that if something were received
No.
so far down the line that we're
No,
stopping?
I think we're the only state in the nation that created an infinite look-back window or no window at all, so we can go back.
No, but I mean in terms of filing a complaint.
No, so, no. So what's gonna, what the CT will, has come out publicly saying this in articles, that he's willing to entertain legislation that would shrink the time for filing to maybe 2 years from today or this year. So, he's.
So you have some certainty.
Yeah, so there's discussion. I mean, he's been out publicly saying that in the news, and I think, that's something that we're gonna have to entertain, but the look back is still
Right.
infinite.
Okay, thank you.
So, but right now, there's no time frame for filing. The Supreme Court of Maryland has not ruled on the constitutionality of this bill yet. They heard oral arguments this summer. That decision's gonna drop any soon. There are two avenues. One is for suits brought in the private sector, one, as far as we're concerned, brought against the government. And, you know, I don't know what they're going to do, but I suspect that private sector, I don't know, we'll see. I'm expecting a split decision on it, but we'll see. But I still think we're going to be on the hook. So, interesting. I just wonder. This is a lot of money, but.
You know how many times I make that face? Good about you.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, that concluded what I was going to talk about. Happy to answer any other questions the committee has.
I do have a question. Where's the wisdom? And I'm asking, and I know you keep saying this is the governor's plan, this is the governor's plan. This isn't obviously something that you've written and said, I would make these changes. That's accurate, correct?
Correct.
So you're just delivering the message of the governor's plan.
Correct.
I have to question the wisdom of the pausing the growth and the concentration of poverty in education and how that, like, does, that was a concern of mine. But then the one that I really wanted you to ask, answer on was the Medicaid. So I thought, did we pass a bill last year? Did this body pass a bill last year about Medicare or Medicaid for all or something? And then we saw in that first 5 weeks, like, once it was rolled out, that there was like a $500 million unexpected. Is that a part of that? Am I wrong in that?
So we've had higher than expected enrollment in Medicaid the last year or two. So during the
And the Medicaid, I just want to be clear, the Medicaid is for the people of like lower income that aren't able to afford it, and then the Medicare is for your elderly.
Correct. So
Okay.
Maryland Medicaid covers children up to 300% of poverty, adults a little over 100% of poverty level.
Continue, I apologize.
Sorry, no, so, I mean, during COVID, we got enhanced federal money to support the Medicaid program, but one of the conditions was that you couldn't disenroll people from Medicaid. So our enrollment grew substantially because no one was dropping off. We were just adding people who were eligible. We went through what they called the unwinding when we were required to finally do redeterminations. Maryland got a lot of waivers from various federal rules that let us keep a lot of people on. So we ended up with a deficit because we were more successful than expected in keeping people on. We are
So
starting
is that
to
where that 500, I just
Yeah, there
remember
was
an
a- there was a
adjustment, it was like
deficit.
500 million in the first month of this budget year. There was an adjustment of like 500 million for Medicaid.
There were concerns. It was driven by both enrollment being higher than expected and healthcare costs just being higher than expected for the people that we're covering. I will say that there's an expectation, so you redetermine each year. A lot of those federal waivers were one-time waivers, so now we're starting to see enrollment drop because they are doing redeterminations and they aren't able to keep people on with these temporary
So we're
waivers.
seeing the drops now. We've
Yeah.
given it to them, and now we're kicking them off because we see we can't afford it.
Well, and we don't have the federal authority to keep people
Just,
on.
I'm just kidding. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Romans, for the presentation. I've gotten some concerns from folks about the VOCA money, and I know it's addressed a couple times in your presentation, I think on page 2, page 6, and then page 25, if I'm looking at it right. Page 25 highlights that it was, I guess, a $60 million appropriation for the program, and now it's down to $35 million. Could you help us understand what sort of impacts that would have, or if there's a specific way those cuts are being distributed, or what we could expect?
Right, so current law has this mandate of $60 million a year for the VOCA program. And the state, basically it's 60 million combined state and federal funds. So whatever federal money we get, if it's short of the 60, the state makes up the difference. It so happens that for fiscal 26, the federal money we're expecting to get goes down quite a bit, which led to a significant increase in the state money. So the governor's proposing to change the mandate to, I believe it's 35 million, I want to say, of state funds. He's trying to cap the state mandate, and the program will kind of ride then on whether federal funds go up or down going forward.
That seems like a drastic cut. Have they given you any indication of if they'll eliminate certain grants and programs, or if kind of everything will take a haircut, or what people can expect?
We have not, we're doing our budget analyses now. We do not have the detail on how that cut would be allocated among the providers.
Okay, thank you for highlighting it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure. I apologize. I'm just like, it's a lot to wrap your brain around, so I really do appreciate you coming out and being able to explain a lot of these things. But, I'm looking just down through here at some of the BRFA, even the BRFA, and they're talking about like the VEEP inspection fees doubling, something as simple as that. Like, is there any data that shows that, have you all been provided, or you're not, that's not something you guys are even worried about really, you're just crafting the numbers, but we've continued this program and it just seems like it's a money maker. Like, are we seeing any of the changes that we're trying to achieve? Or is everything status quo and we're just finding new ways to take more money from people? I mean, the trade-in allowance is a whole nother issue, but the VEEP thing is, we're doubling it. One thing, not a phase-in or anything, and we're taking away, I just have a hard time with explaining when people want to ask, like, well, why is this? Every fee I have is going up. Every time now they're attaching a fee if I do an installment fee for my registration because you doubled my registration amount, but now you're offering to pay annually instead of biannually. Oh, but you got to pay a fee on top of that to do it. I mean, I don't know if that's.
I mean, I think in both the general fund and in the transportation area, you're seeing that there's been a mismatch between what the state, certainly the executive, wants to do in terms of spending levels and what the current revenues support. So they're trying to address on the transportation side in particular by doing some revenue enhancements so they can avoid making big cuts to the transportation program. In the general fund, you see more of a balance between cuts and revenues.
Thank you.
Sure.
No.
Thank you. And I was looking at page 6 with the discretionary enhancements. I know it says Trade Point Atlantic for some sort of container terminal, 30 million, and this Ion Q corporate headquarters, 10 million. I must, again, I don't do budgets, but how often does the state of Maryland give that kind of money to private, for-profit companies to do this type of, whatever it is that they're doing?
I mean, in the capital budget, we often provide, money for projects that are economic development oriented. These are both capital related projects. We're using cash rather than bonds, but I mean, we don't do it a lot, but it's certainly not unprecedented in any way.
And I've always, I've heard the term pay-go, but never quite understood. What does that mean?
So pay-go just means that it stands for pay as you go, but it's doing capital with cash rather than bonds.
Gotcha.
So the governor's got, 1.7 billion of bonds in his capital budget, but he's also supplementing it with a little bit of general funds being spent on a cash basis to support projects.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
One last. Okay, yeah. No, you go right ahead. I apologize. I think it's one time.
You can follow up, but I just want you to speak a little bit more about eliminating this itemization on taxes, right? He's going to increase the standard deduction across the board. That's not income dependent. And then first, how many states don't allow itemized deductions? What's the nature of the kind of people that do? I'm trying to get a sense of this because it seems to me, in, big words, what you're really doing, it's a tax on middle and higher income people without, increasing taxes directly. It's an indirect way to do that.
Yeah.
Unless you're telling me your analysis is, by increasing the standard deduction, I doubt this is true, but increasing the standard deduction will, level off, keep people at the same place. But I doubt that's happening, right?
Right, so like I said earlier, like 23% of Maryland
Yeah, I
is
heard that.
itemized. The in tax year 23, the average amount of itemization was in the high 20,000s. So if you're a joint filer and you were close to
Yeah.
30,000, and now you're going to get a standard deduction of 11,200. So it makes
So there's
$18,000
your
to $20,000
$10,000
more of your income taxable. So it clearly will have an impact on, people in those situations.
Right, and would you be able to, I assume your shop will be able to give us a little more breakdown on, the Marylanders affected by this. I remember when O'Malley was in office and there were, you were there, innumerable taxes. Many of us asked for and were able to receive some breakdown of numbers for people in our counties, right? So we could determine how many people were going to get a tax increase. Do you have that ability, and could you
Yeah,
provide something along those lines?
So we are, for our fiscal note, we are working on county by county fiscal impacts
Okay.
for you. I do have, and I can provide the committee, for, again, tax year 2023, the percentage of people in each county who itemize, because there's a
Yes.
surprising variation amongst counties
Yes.
about itemization.
All right,
So I'm
thank you.
happy to provide that.
Thank you. 50.
Senator Vogel.
Thank you. So I don't see it here, I can't find it right away, but I'm being told that somewhere there's a $60 million investment into a study of the red line. So,
It could be, I'd have to check. There's definitely money in the budget for red line planning.
yeah, I mean, $60 million for a study of the red line seems to be a bit excessive in the economic crisis we're in. And when I look at that, I know, like, for my district, Route 15 is a very important economic driving factor that we need another lane in each direction to go through the corridor of Frederick City, because it creates a bottleneck off 270 and 70, right there at the intersect. I would pay for half of that. I just don't, so I'd like to see where that is, if you could find that for me, the $60 million. And then if you could explain to me, when I'm looking at on page 40, the revenue yield from property tax rates above the constant yield, am I?
Yeah, so what we're trying to illustrate on page 40 is that property assessments are going up.
Yeah, and I'm seeing, like, in Frederick County, if I'm looking at it correctly, it looks like we were really disproportionately, our yield went up quite a bit compared to everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, it just reflects the assessments that are being done. And it does appear, Frederick, I mean, if you look on page 39, you can see the triennial assessment valuations. And Frederick has had very high assessment growth in each of the last 3 assessments.
I mean, it's very, very high.
It's above the state
Disproportionately high.
average, for sure.
I mean, so is that for an issue then for us to look at with SDAT or what? Because this is a very real problem in my community. I have people, last year I was contacted, we have an elderly concentration of people around some of the more growing areas apparently. Never refinanced their house, been in there 27 years, never did anything. They got their new assessment and their house payment went from $995, which they did 25 years ago, a little rancher, to like $1,672, just off the property tax rate, $772 more. Like, what are we doing? Like, we're literally trying to find money and we're adjusting the yield, and I see what you're saying, but, huh?
He's just giving us the analysis.
I'm not a
What's
property tax assessor.
driving such a major shift in the value of Frederick County that is creating such a disproportionate increase in property values?
I mean, I think, and we're seeing statewide that homes are selling for higher prices than they did a few years ago. And that's what the assessors are looking at, is what are sales like and how does that change valuations? So I'm not a property tax assessor.
No,
I'm
I
not
get it.
Here to defend or not, but I mean, it's largely based on, transactions going on in each community.
All right.
Now, all the
Thank
real
you.
estate pressures we're having.
Thank you, sir. My question is, with the LBIs, I know that in this budget right now, there isn't any money for local bond initiatives. We as the General Assembly normally find that money. Is that correct?
Yeah, so actually, there's, the governor in his capital budget left 50 million for the General
So 50
Assembly to
million.
allocate as it wishes, so.
Okay, so taking that number, which is a normal number, what we come out in the past from the General Assembly, has there ever been a pause in local bond initiatives and looking at what would be the refinance of that billion-dollar debt, and where would there be any savings that money could then, and this is not a policy, it might go to people who are hurting and those type of things. So
I mean, so we pay those bonds off over 15 years. So if you didn't do the 50 million, the annual savings is going to be a couple of $1 million.
So it's not,
it's not going to be
that's not an
significant.
opportunity there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question you may not be able to answer, but to dovetail on what my seatmate was saying about the taxes, housing taxes. And now I just want to know, there's a category on there that says home improvement, right? On the tax bill, it says home improvement. Last year, they had me down for $50,000. This year, they had me down for $600,000. And I didn't make $600,000 worth of improvements on my home. So what goes into that calculation that allows them to do that before I go to the state and raise hell?
I am not the person to answer that question.
Okay,
I don't have
thought that because,
enough
okay,
information.
thank you.
Oh, you should.
Just one last question on page 5. Developmental disabilities and the autism waiver autism waiver slower expansion. What is that?
So the state has been expanding its autism waiver to provide, assistance to more families. The administration's expansion is just slower than we were expecting it to be. It's not that they're not continuing to expand the program. They're just expanding it a little slower than we thought.
So meaning they're not gonna, are they pausing that money, or are they decreasing?
They're not going to add
it?
as many families as they would otherwise have done. So everyone who's already in the waiver program gets covered, and they're still growing the waiver program, but not growing it as aggressively as it was originally planned.
And, okay, thank you.
Been really,
Thank
really
you.
helpful. Kate, good to see you. Thanks for being here. Thank you.
So we need like a 5-minute break because I
All
have
right.
to switch the system over.
We're going to take a 5-minute break while we switch the system over, and we'll get right into our bill hearings.